There's an old terrible expression in television news, which was what I did for a long time before I started doing this. I used to be a White House television correspondent, and I was a TV news anchorman in the States before I started doing this. But the old expression goes, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then remind them what you just told them.
Okay, interesting.
Does a sophisticated investor need to hear it that way? Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe.
Does an audience of 3,000 people at some conference need to hear it structured that way? Maybe, maybe not. But for most people, the notion of repeating something is really alien because you feel funny if you do that. If I tell you, if we're just having coffee together and I tell you something, if I tell you something a second or a third time, you're going to think that, maybe I'm not all there, right? But in a public communication, a certain amount of repetition can be a good thing.
Hi everyone and welcome to Conversations with Loulou. It's episode 52 and my guest is Bill Connor, who flew from the US to be with us on the show today. Bill is the founder and CEO of 3. It's a media coaching consultancy that works with CEOs, leaders, and politicians to deliver effective presentations, speeches, and media interviews. Prior to founding his consultancy, Bill worked as a White House television correspondent and anchorman for 15 years. In this conversation, we're going to be talking about the art of presenting, how to put together a proper presentation, how to deliver it, and how to get what you want out of that presentation. So let's tune in. Bill, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I come to the GCC region something like once a month for business, and it's just so invigorating. The spirit of promise and possibility here is
Indeed.
just...
You go to Saudi quite a bit, right?
I go to Saudi quite a bit in Dubai.
Where the action's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I've been doing that for 12 years now. I work with lots of different types of corporate clients and government clients, all different types of industries. And yeah, just sort of this collective spirit of let's do this thing is really inspiring.
Well, now you're on the other end of being interviewed. Usually you're the one asking all the questions, right?
I know.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can do this properly.
So let's dive right into it. I'm curious, Bill. I mean, you've interviewed so many people in your life. You trained so many people, leaders, politicians, CEOs. What makes somebody memorable?
The courage to be different and to take some creative chances with messaging. So often you'll see people in the corporate world, people in the government world talking in government speak, business speak. They use acronyms. They sort of talk around the topic. They don't know how to be a storyteller, for example. But once in a while, I'll work with someone to whom that comes naturally. And actually, the great thing is that even for people for whom it doesn't come naturally, it is a learnable skill. I work with a lot of fairly famous people who are extroverted, and maybe you wouldn't know that from looking at sort of their public images. And when we're behind closed doors, they'll say, I know I look like a master of the universe, but actually I'm petrified of public speaking.
So they're introverted?
Many of them are, and in fact, introverts are often the best clients. They're the most willing and eager to learn. I mean, obviously, natural extroverts can be great storytellers. They can be very charismatic, but at the same time, they can be a little bit undisciplined in the way they deliver the information, and they might say something that they shouldn't. But so just to give you an example, a guy like Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet. He's not a client of mine. I don't mean to claim that. But, not long ago, or actually more than once, he said that AI is as important to the future, the development of humanity as fire and electricity.
Okay.
So that kind of colorful language, making an effort to hear things that we haven't heard before, and then putting them into a narrative, sort of getting our attention with that sort of bold, perhaps unprecedented type of statement, and then putting it into a narrative that people can relate to really helps to get the message across. There's another guy who is the founder of a company called Shared Studios, named Amar Bakshi. Shared Studios is an idea, I don't know if there's one in Dubai yet, but basically it's a network around the world of shipping containers. And you walk into one of these shipping containers and you can have a conversation with someone in another shipping container around the world through a very sophisticated video conferencing system for all intents and purposes. But you're standing there, and because of the way this space is configured, it feels as though you're in the same room as that person in Tokyo or New York or whatever it is. And so, he might begin a presentation or he might begin an interview by saying something like, can you imagine walking into a shipping container and immediately being face-to-face with someone on the other side of the world? This is what Shared Studio does. And the reason we do it is to build understanding and connections around the world at a particularly difficult time in this world, perhaps.
So you need to, so those who are memorable, if I understood you correctly, are those who are able to take creative risks, right, and are able to make perhaps associations with what they're presenting and something that maybe people are familiar with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but in an unusual way.
Precisely. Tell me something I haven't heard before. I often tell my clients, whether you're preparing for a news media interview, a podcast, a show like this, a presentation, a speech, a conference appearance, it's about starting strongly, getting to the point, and being different, as I was just describing. So often you'll see somebody begin a presentation or an investor pitch by saying, hello, it's great to be here today. I guess we should get started now.
Can you hear me?
Right.
Can you hear me?
Right.
Is this thing working?
That's
everyone.
Thing.
Yeah.
Whereas if you begin with something really immediately arresting, that immediately makes the audience say, whoa, where are we going here? What's this journey this person is taking me on here? Immediately, it shows respect to the audience, first and foremost. It says to the audience that I care about making this interesting and useful and meaningful to you. And then getting to the point, in almost any presentation, but certainly in something like an investor pitch, you don't want to get immediately down into the technical weeds. Tell me what the problem is and tell me how your solution fixes that problem. As somebody who's heard 1,000 investor pitches yourself, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then once again, just being different in general, using different types of devices, whether it's storytelling, whether it's using beautiful, simple visuals to tell the story, whether you're holding a prop of some type saying, this piece of technology will change the world. Just something that transcends the normal sort of business language that people engage in every day. And that's something that they have to make an effort to do, because if you work at a tech company or if you work at a law firm or if you work at a hospital or whatever, you have this sort of proprietary language that you speak with your colleagues all day long.
Yes.
If you're trying to convince someone or persuade someone who doesn't live in that particular world, you're just going to bore them and confuse them if you fall back on that type of thing.
I think there's also something which probably is important as well, which is coming across as authentic and genuine as well. I mean, sometimes I see it because I've been in boot camps where, for example, people teach entrepreneurs how to pitch. And then they tell them, like, you should start with a story, and then, you know what I mean? Then you talk about the problem, then you talk about the solution, etc. But then what happens is that they all kind of follow the same sequence. and it feels forced, it doesn't feel natural. So somebody has to like search their life, right, and come up with some story that they tell you, and sometimes they hit it, right, and the story makes sense, but sometimes the story is like, you know what I mean? Like it kind of backfires, I feel sometimes.
Yeah, you have to hit on a story which, as you say, it is authentic and is not, and sort of break free of some of those constraints. I mean, definitely, again, as you know,
like that sequence, right? So start with the story, do the problem. So you hear the pitches, and they kind of flow in the same way, and it defies the purpose.
Try something different. The new CEO of YouTube, Neil Mohan, recently gave a presentation, and he began by demonstrating Bard, the Google ChatGPT equivalent, and he was taking a risk because he started asking Bard, what is this thing called YouTube? And he didn't know if it would say something positive or negative or crazy. Yes, exactly. Okay. And so, but he sort of had the idea and the courage to try that, and it went over great. So you want to be able to obviously control an environment like that as much as you can, but in that particular case, it worked out really well.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, so I think there's three things I'd like people to come out with from this conversation. First is how to put together a good presentation from like a content standpoint or in a flow. How to deliver that presentation, whether it's in person, whether it's virtual, and how do you get basically that how do you deliver that ask and get what you want out of it?
Well, it's funny that you say 3 because that happens to be the name of my company. My company is called 3 Media and Presentation Training. And I by no means invented the concept myself. The rule of 3s is as old as the hills, as they say. When you think about faith, hope, and charity, or you think about liberty, equality, fraternity, or the 3 Musketeers, or there's just something, I don't know how scientific or unscientific it is, there's just something that resonates with audiences about information when it's grouped into 3s.
Okay.
So when I fundamentally begin to show people how to put together a presentation, that presentation has 3 components. The first component is getting the audience's attention. The second component is sort of the heart of the presentation, the key messages. And the third part is a powerful conclusion. So we actually have a method whereby we help clients brainstorm what the fundamental raw material needs to be, and then we say, okay, how are you going to get my attention at the beginning? Should that be something like a quote or a story or what have you? And you're right. I mean, you don't want everybody to do the same thing because maybe their authenticity would suffer that way. But we try to help them find something that we haven't heard before, and we've heard a lot of presentations. So you get their attention with something colorful, and then you tell them you tell your audience why you began the way you began. What's the point? I told you this story because this is representative of X, Y, and Z. And then you kind of remind them or sort of pre-remind them of why they should care about this. Either implicitly or explicitly, you say, you should care about what I'm about to tell you for the following reasons. This will make you a lot of money. This will make the world a safer and more beautiful place, what have you. So you begin that way. And then you identify 3 key messages in your presentation. So my product does this. Number 2, it's going to be distributed on this particular platform. And number 3, something else. I don't know yet. But in other words, you just make it unmistakable. You kind of flag each of the messages. Now I'm going to talk about this message number 1, number 2, and number 3.
Okay.
And it's the format is scalable. It's something that you can use for a 5-minute presentation, a 10-minute presentation, or a 20-minute presentation. Fundamentally, it's still the same. You still start the way I described, and then you have the kind of the meat of the presentation in the middle, But the supporting information for that heart of the presentation determines how long the presentation is going to be, right? You still have your 3 messages, but maybe message number 1 has 4 minutes worth of supporting information. Mm-hmm. Same thing with messages 2 and 3 for a 15-minute presentation. Mm-hmm. But if you want to make a shorter presentation, the amount of supporting detail you would put underneath each of those messages would be less. Mm-hmm. And then when you get to the end of the presentation, you reiterate your key messages, and then you deliver the ask. Now that I've told you all of this, I'm looking for an investment of 5 million dirhams, or I would like for you to join us, collaborate with us on this particularly critical enterprise. Whatever it is, that's the point in the presentation where you make the ask. Again, it doesn't have to be in that particular sequence every single time, but we've found that this particular method works. And then finally, you want to end strongly, just the way I was describing before, that oftentimes people begin in kind of a boring way. Oftentimes they'll end in sort of an uninspired way also. They'll say, I guess that's all I have to say. I don't know, Loulou, do you have any questions for me? Right? If you can end on a powerful note with maybe revisiting that device that you started with at the beginning of the presentation, or you don't have to do that, you can use something else, but just some sort of final words or final image or final idea that makes the audience walk away with something memorable. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you know, audiences' attention spans are getting worse and shorter all the time. Absolutely. So you really have to deliver the information in a way that literally people can remember, at least your key points, if not the whole thing.
A couple of questions on this. So is there a reason why you need to preempt people? So now I'm going to talk to you about this. Is there,
I wouldn't call it preempting. I would just call it sort of signaling to them where you're going to make it abundantly clear. Not every audience requires that, but once again, I just find that by saying, okay, now I'm going to tell you this. There's an old terrible expression in television news, which was what I did for a long time before I started doing this. I used to be a White House television correspondent, and I was a TV news anchorman in the States before I started doing this. But the old expression goes, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then remind them what you just told them.
Okay, interesting.
Does a sophisticated investor need to hear it that way? Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe.
Does an audience of 3,000 people at some conference need to hear it structured that way? Maybe, maybe not. But I don't, I think if your material is really strong and colorful in the way that I've been describing, it can't hurt to be, a certain amount of repetition is actually not a bad thing, and that's particularly important in news media interviews. Up to this point, Loulou, we've been talking primarily about presentations per se. If you're doing an interview with a journalist, if you have the opportunity to be interviewed by CNBC or by Al Arabiya or whatever it happens to be, that's different, and we can talk and we can get into the particulars of that in just a little bit. But for most people, the notion of repeating something is really alien, because you feel funny if you do that. If I tell you, if we're just having coffee together and I tell you something, if I tell you something a second or a third time, you're going to think that, maybe I'm not all there, right? But in a public communication, a certain amount of repetition can be a good thing.
In any, even if you're working as a brand, and if you're working, let's say, with a media agency, there's always a certain frequency, right, that people need to hear your ad so that they can recall it. So I think there is merit, obviously, with
and many different platforms, right?
Yes.
If you have a new campaign for a product or whatever it happens to be, you're going to see paid advertising on the side of a bus going by on Sheikh Zayed Road over here, or on television, or a spokesperson will do an interview With free media, there'll be a social media component and everything. Yeah, you're right. It once again, because the attention span of the average person is shrinking by the minute here, the more and in more different ways that a person hears that message, the more it sticks.
And there's another comment as well on something you said. I think the ending is probably, in my experience, is probably something that most people forget to work on completely. I mean, you're right. I think people put an effort maybe in the beginning because now they understand, oh, I have to do something different to get your attention. But I think the end is probably forgotten. It's more like what you said, oh, well, that's all I have to say, or you know what I mean? I think it's interesting, actually. You shouldn't forget about that.
Yeah, and once again, I'm giving everybody who's watching and listening to this permission to be creative about this. Obviously, every audience is different. If you're talking to a government minister in a very formal type of a setting, perhaps you can't get away with certain things you could if you're talking to a tech investor or what have you. Obviously, considering your audience in every situation is really important. But just generally speaking, don't be boring. Tell me something I haven't heard before, and use language that maybe I haven't heard before. I'll just give you a very sort of everyday example. I was in Puerto Rico just a couple of weeks ago, and in Puerto Rico, they have an expression that I had never heard before, which is arroz y frijoles, which literally translates as rice and beans. Okay. But what it means is the basics, right? You say, let's get down now, let's stop fooling around, let's get down to the arroz y frijoles. Okay. So, I've been around a long time, I had never heard that before. And so let's get down to the rice and beans. I mean, something like that I just thought was charming,
So going back to the presentation bit, so start strong, have 3 key points that you want to get the message across, deliver the meat around these 3 points, and end very strongly.
Correct.
This is, and what if would you follow that kind of same logic if you are emailing this presentation, if let's say you don't have the chance to be sitting with someone on a one-to-one? So for example, like as someone who invests, I see a lot of pitch decks, and sometimes you see some terrible pitch decks, right? And you think, why do I need to look at 40 slides, right? I mean, it needs to be short and snappy. As you said, people don't have the attention span. So I feel sometimes that people feel the need to cram a lot of information in there, and it's so difficult to keep it simple sometimes.
To me, there's a fundamental difference between a communication that is intended to be only read as opposed to a communication that has a spoken component. So yes, absolutely. In the context of a live presentation that's supported by something like a few slides or images or what have you, yes, I'm a big proponent of making it as simple as you possibly can. If you're going to email someone, if you don't have the opportunity to do a face-to-face presentation, whether it's literally face-to-face or virtually, and we should talk about that also, the differences between doing something in person and doing something via Zoom or via Teams or whatever, it's important for you to remember that if it's something that you're just emailing somebody, you need somewhat more description. You need some well-chosen words that you wouldn't necessarily put on the slides that are accompanying a spoken presentation.
So you need almost 2 versions, right? You need the version that you would email and the version that you would present. And
what we often tell, that's a great observation, because what we often tell people is even when they give a live presentation, again, in the interest of not putting too much stuff on your slides, which are going to detract from the words that you're saying, you can say to your audience, listen, I'm giving you the fundamentals, the overview here. If you need to know more of the sort of supporting details, we have another more detailed document that we can send you after we finish talking here today.
Okay, and then delivering, I mean, you mentioned something very important, which is delivering virtually. Everything is being done virtually now, right? There's, I think, an opportunity to meet someone face-to-face is becoming rare.
For 2.5 years during COVID, I didn't do any face-to-face training. And so virtually, and again, for all during COVID, I don't think I did a single face-to-face training session. It was just started up again maybe about a year ago. When you present virtually, of course, you have the additional challenge. In addition to everything else you're nervous about already, you have the additional challenge of not knowing or having a very difficult time of knowing exactly how the audience on the other side is responding. If I'm sitting right here with you, I can see your facial expression, I can see your body language, everything else. But if you're looking into a tiny little camera here on the top of your screen and the other person is 1,000 miles away, how do you assess how they're taking in what you're saying? So with that in mind, you have to be especially interesting, I believe, in order to get your points across and to come across well on camera. There are a few basic things with setting up your video environment for a better virtual presentation. It's some very simple things like make sure that your camera is at the right level. So if you're sitting at your desk and you're using the webcam on your laptop,
people are not seeing like half of your head.
They're not seeing the ceiling and, like this. And similarly, you don't want it to be too high, right? So maybe you grab a couple of old university textbooks and you put it underneath your laptop so you raise the camera to that level. Other things that I see all the time, I see people often sitting in front of a window because they think, the natural light is great, I'll let the natural light illuminate me. Well, if the window is behind you, your face is going to be dark, it doesn't work. Natural light is great because it's flattering. You don't get a lot of sort of downward shadows on your face with natural light, but you have to be facing the natural light. So, the window is here, the camera is here, and you're here like this. Backgrounds. I hate virtual backgrounds because, if you have a proper green screen and you have a good quality camera, yes, you can throw up a virtual background behind you, but most people don't. And I'm sure you've seen this, Loulou.
They're horrible.
They're horrible. And
you move, you can see your head, like your ears could be cut off. Your head's
exploding, or you move your hand like this and your hand disappears like that. And so I think the best sort of background is a real background. And so long as you can set up your background in a polished and professional way. So you've got in your home studio here, you've got all this cool stuff all around us, and it's really visually interesting.
Yeah.
That's not an easy thing for a lot of people. They think, well, gosh, I'm doing this particular Teams meeting from my house, and I've got 6 kids running around in the background and a big pile of laundry or whatever it is. So why don't I put up one of those filters behind me that blurs everything? I think ideally you would find a proper background.
I think just to build on what you're saying, it's in a face-to-face presentation, you have to take care of what you're wearing and how your hair looks and all these things. In a virtual presentation, it's the same thing. You might be wearing shorts at the bottom, right? But your environment, it's like that extra thing that you need to take care of is that background. What are people seeing? I think it's so important, especially because people do so many of these virtual meetings now.
Yeah.
And even potentially invest in a USB mic that you can plug in so that even the sound quality is good, especially if you're doing media interviews.
Well, here, because of the format of your program, this is a podcast which is also being videoed for your YouTube channel. So, and you have very nice professional mics here. For most people, I recommend what's called a lavalier microphone, a small clip-on mic, just because this is a certain look. We look like we're podcasting here. If you're delivering a presentation for some other reason, I think as unobtrusive a microphone as possible is better. And the good thing about a lavalier mic is that it's directional. So if the dog is barking or the kids are running around outside, there's a pretty good chance that the audience won't hear that.
Okay, let's take a quick break. Hi all, since we're on a quick break, I want to take the opportunity to deliver 2 quick messages for you. Firstly, the show is gaining a lot of popularity, which is great. I'm being approached by PR agencies, pitching CEOs. I'm being approached by individuals, by entrepreneurs, pitching themselves. While I would love to be able to accommodate everybody, unfortunately I can't. But what I would suggest as an alternative is for you to consider sponsoring the show. You can reach out to me on conversationswithloulou.com if you're interested in being affiliated with Conversations with Loulou and speaking directly to our audience as a sponsor. The second message is that I would really love to get to know you, our audiences, a little bit more. And I've created a short survey that I would really appreciate if you could fill it. You can find the link to the survey in the show's description, on the podcast, on YouTube, and also on my website. Please spend a few minutes to fill up the survey. It would really help me in getting to know you better and making sure that the content that I'm creating here is value adding to you. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about preparing for the interview or for a performance, not a performance. Okay, let's say a pitch. So you're going to you're an entrepreneur. Let's take the scenario, and you've been invited to do a global pitch, and you have 2 minutes to deliver your presentation, and you're super nervous, and you think, oh my God, I have this great opportunity, and I'm going to blow it. So what do you do to get yourself ready?
Practice is the number one most important thing you can do to conquer nervousness. If you can minimize your fear of the unknown, the less nervous you will be. And what I mean by that is that once you've put the material together, once you've figured out, once you've done all the things we've been talking about up to this point, so you have great content, then if you practice that content, you will feel less nervous in the moment because you'll know where you're going. The anxiety that might come from in the middle of the presentation, I can't believe I forgot what I was going to say, that is less likely if you have devoted the time to practice repeatedly out loud beforehand. Some people will ask me, isn't there such a...
Don't wing it, basically.
Do not wing it. Okay. If there's any takeaway from our conversation here is you never wing it. But no, in all seriousness, you're right. A lot of people are so afraid of public speaking that they're even afraid of practicing, right? They'll say, well, okay, I've got my presentation. I have to give it on Friday. I'm just going to put it in a drawer until Friday and then hope I survive on Friday. You will definitely be very nervous if you do that. Whereas if it's Monday and you've got until Friday, every day if you go into your office and you shut the door and you stand up and you deliver the presentation as if you were doing the real thing, the more familiar, the more the material will become a part of you, and once again, that nervousness you may feel from searching for the words will be greatly minimized. Is there such a thing as over-practicing? Theoretically, yes. But in other words, you can practice so much that you lose all of the passion and the spontaneity that you might have in the presentation. But as a practical matter, Loulou, I never see that because most people are so busy running their companies or doing their jobs and dealing with their families and everything else. It's not like they have 4 hours every day that they can over practice in, right? The second most important thing is a few specific techniques you can employ to make you feel calmer in the moment. And one that I often use is a very simple breathing exercise whereby I inhale to a count of 5. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I exhale to a count of 10. Okay. And if you do that 10 times, 10 repetitions, it will actually slow your heart rate a little bit and calm you down somewhat. And it's great because you can do that when there are other people around and they won't know that you're doing it. You can be sitting in the front row waiting for your turn to walk up out on the stage and speak, and you can silently do the breathing exercise. Nobody will know you're doing it. Another thing is visualization. Many professional and elite athletes work with sports psychologists on visualization techniques. So if you're a top tennis player, for example, you work with your sports psychologist and you play a little movie in your brain of yourself succeeding at what you're about to attempt in the real instance. So if you're serving for the match at the French Open, right before you throw the ball in the air, you step back for a second and a half and you visualize, you play this little movie in your brain of yourself smashing the ball and winning the tournament and receiving a check for 3 million euros or whatever it is. And then similarly with public speaking, if you visualize yourself walking up on the stage with your head held high, nice long strides, chest out, feeling strongly, when it comes time to do it for real, you say, I don't need to be intimidated. I just saw in my mind's eye that I can do this. Let's go. You know, it's a little psychological trick that we play on ourselves, but it can be effective. And then the last thing that a lot of people use is something called power poses, which you may have heard of. There's a famous TED talk from some years ago in which a speaker talks about how we've always known that our emotions influence our body language. If we are afraid, our bodies tend to get smaller.
Shrinks, yeah.
If we're feeling triumphant, if you run the Dubai Marathon and you cross the finish line, your body naturally gets bigger like this. And the speaker talks about how this is buried in our DNA. It's behaviors that are thousands of generations old. We just do them naturally. So the question then becomes, well, can we flip this and make it work in reverse to our advantage? If our emotions affect our bodies, can we make our bodies affect our emotions? And so this particular TED speaker, her name is Dr. Amy Cuddy, came up with this thing called power poses. And it's very simple. It means that before you do this thing that's going to make you nervous, you go and you stand up and you hold your 2 fists above your head like this, and you hold this position for 2 solid minutes. And 2 minutes does not sound like a very long time, but it kind of is when you do it. And the point is that when you finally drop your arms, your chin is still kind of high like this, and your chest is sort of puffed out like this, and you're kind of, you have this imprint on your body and therefore on your mind of, hey, let's go. I'm not, what do I have to be afraid of?
Yeah.
Right? And then the last thing I would say is that ultimately it's not about you. It's about the information. It's about this offering that you're giving to your audience. Yeah, I mean, if you're doing an investor pitch, the prospective investor wants to like you and feel confident in your skills. But in other words, it can make you a little bit less nervous if you say to yourself, this is really about this important idea I'm sharing, rather than about me and I'm having this, what they call imposter syndrome and that sort of thing.
I love that. I mean, with I remember actually, I have been taught the power pose, but the rationale I had was that you have to make your body physically bigger.
Yeah.
So not as, it's slightly different from a variation of what you said of basically holding your fists up, but you actually have to stretch yourself as much as possible to make yourself as big as possible.
Same thing.
The other thing actually, which I find useful because I do quite a bit of public speaking, and there's always this nervousness, you can't shake it off. There's that first minute, right? No matter where you are, but you have something for it.
If you know that the first words out of your mouth are going to be really, really powerful, that will give you great self-confidence. So, in other words, it begins with coming up with an opening idea that is unmistakably terrific, right? Okay. If you know that in those first 30 seconds you deliver something that's going to make the audience say, whoa, I didn't know that. Where's she going with this? That will give you self-confidence. You're absolutely right. I hear that from our clients all the time. I'm great after the first 30 seconds. I'm dying inside for the first 30 seconds.
There's this kind of stage fright. I don't know what it is. It's
just natural.
But something I find useful is that I look at the audience, or I visualize the audience, and I think these are all people like me who have their insecurities, who have issues, who probably having a bad day or a good day. I mean, they're people. So I try to not make the audience look like this body that's going to come and judge me or what I'm saying or something like that. I try to humanize them, right? They're just people, like, even if it's the CEO of the biggest company or this minister or whoever it is in the audience that's listening, they are just people like me. So I find that helpful as well.
Absolutely. There's an expression, remember that everyone else is fighting their own battle every day.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's a very important thing to keep in mind.
It helps.
Especially if you're, let's say you're a startup founder and you're talking to this intimidating VC person who's seen it all.
Startup pitches are very, very intimidating because when do you do a startup pitch? When you're typically early in the process, right? You're starting up your business, you're going out to fundraise for the first time, probably. And this is where you're like thrust in this environment where you have to pitch in front of VCs, in front of different people, colleagues, etc. And I think it's quite intimidating. And typically you have like 2 minutes to deliver your full idea and get to what you want, and deliver your ask and get the investment. And so it's quite intimidating. And I feel if you don't humanize the people in front of you, and if you think that they're smarter than me or better than me, or I need something from them or something, then it becomes difficult to get what you want.
One of the things I love most about my work is that if I'm working with a CEO or a well-known politician or a public figure, oftentimes when it's just me and that person together in the room with no one else, that they will unburden themselves to me. You know, I look like I'm on top of the world, but I'm nervous about this, or I'm really worried about that, or I'm concerned that I'm not getting the job done in a particular area.
Yeah.
So yes, if you can, as you say, if you can remind yourself that everybody else is dealing
it's the same.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So what about talking to the media? Because I mean, this is obviously your specialty, right? And so how would one get what they want out of the interview? So you spoke earlier in the beginning of this discussion about the power of repetition. So what is it? Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, that remind them?
You got it.
Yeah?
Loulou.
Okay.
Exactly.
So how do you make sure that you get what you want out of that interview?
Well, first and foremost, you have to have a plan. In other words, you don't just do an interview because the phone rings and a reporter is on the other end. There are some cases in which you may not want to do the interview with that particular news organization on that particular occasion for that particular reason. But if you have determined, and it's good to get some advice, if you have somebody who can give you some media relations advice, how can we insert ourselves into this conversation about AI or about whatever it happens to be? And then you make the determination, what reporters should we reach out to? And then you come up with a story pitch, and then you finally get down to actually doing the interview. All of that ideally would come first. But when you have decided that you want to do this interview because it's in your interest, then you have to think about, yes, this brief period of time you have to get your key messages across. And
because you typically don't have, right? You have 3 minutes, 2-3 minutes.
If it's a live TV interview on Good Morning Abu Dhabi or what have you, you probably only have 4 minutes or something like that. So this is one time in your life that you're permitted to be a little bit selfish. And what I mean by that is that the whole reason you're going on that program is to advance your agenda. It's not about, because you're a nice person, you're showing up to do the interview as a public service. You're doing it so that the people of the United Arab Emirates or the people of the world or whatever it is can hear about your idea, your product, whatever it happens to be. And so with that in mind, you have to credibly ensure that you get your messages out in the interview, no matter what direction the journalist chooses to go in. And to be really, really clear about this, I'm not talking about being evasive or about lying or anything like that, which of course we see way too much of in the news media these days. I'm just talking about figuring out a credible way to get your messages across. So let's say you go on a program and you want to talk about the investment community, or you want to talk about investment trends here in the region. I just read yesterday that investment in the Middle East, North Africa region was down 93% in the month of April. Let's say you want to talk about that and you want to get those points across, and the reporter wants to talk about something else. How do you bring the conversation back to those messages? And the way you do that is persistence. First of all, you figure out what your messages are, and you employ something that we call a pivot or a bridge in a credible way, once again, to get back to the message. So if I want to talk to you about this news that came out yesterday about startup investment going down, and the reporter wants to talk about something else, if I'm the reporter and I ask you a question like, I want to talk to you about this story that Lionel Messi may take $400 million to go play in Saudi Arabia. How do you bring the conversation back to what you want to talk about? So you might use a bridge or a pivot like, Bill, that's a really interesting question. I'm a big soccer fan, but getting back to talking about trends in startup investment, and then you're off and running like that. It's as simple as that. There are some times when if the question is really inappropriate or is really completely afield, you can use a more blunt kind of a bridge, whereby you would say, I'm not really here to talk about that today. Thank you for that question, Loulou, but I'm here to talk about trends in investing here. Okay. So the point is that it's about remembering that you're there to talk about what you want to talk about, and you can, using these techniques, ensure that you do that and not harm your credibility at the same time.
Interesting. So I guess also it goes back to being really, really prepared in terms of what you want to say. Otherwise, you're going to forget and you're probably not going to say it. You have this opportunity and you miss it.
And just as I said, with practicing before a speech or a presentation, if you're going to do an interview, you should get a colleague or you should get a friend to play the role of the journalist and sit down and give your colleague some suggested questions to ask you, so you get familiar with the messages you want to deliver. And
the other thing I got from what you said is that it's okay not to answer a question if you find it irrelevant or inappropriate, as you say. You don't have to answer every question.
There's no law requiring you. Just because the reporter, to be clear about this, I was a journalist myself for a very long time. Most journalists I know are honorable professionals who are trying to tell the story and to try to tell the truth. But once in a while, a reporter will choose to ask you a provocative question for whatever reason, or may ask you an off-topic question or a hostile question. Just because they do that, you are not required to go necessarily where they may be trying to take you.
Very interesting. A few more questions, I think, before we wrap. What are your views on humor, using humor in presentations and interviews?
I love it when it's appropriate and if you can do it well. There's some people who simply can't tell a joke properly, and so maybe people like that should stay away from it. But yes, within the boundaries of appropriateness, it's great. It's great to loosen the audience up. Sometimes the audience is nervous too, right? You think you're nervous, but sometimes the audience is nervous, and they want you to succeed. Right? Very seldom is it the case that you're delivering to an audience that's sort of against you from the beginning. They want the experience of listening to you talk to be interesting and enjoyable on a certain level.
They're there to watch you speak.
That's right. So yeah, I think humor is great as long as it's actually funny and as long as it's fresh. Oftentimes you'll hear a joke that you've heard before and you want to avoid that.
Okay. And what about engaging with the audience? So I see it sometimes, on panels or things like that, and someone would say, show of hands, like, tell me who is this, or something like that.
I'm a little bit against that, actually,
Yeah.
Loulou, because it's become a cliche. Oftentimes, people will begin a presentation by saying, okay, how many people have tried ChatGPT?
Yes.
And the problem with that is that audiences can be shy, so oftentimes you'll get sort of a tepid response. Maybe like one or two people will say, I've tried that. You don't get this sort of resounding response that you hope you're getting. Also, I think that by asking a question like that, it's not as powerful as declaring something yourself as the subject matter expert, right? Rather than saying, how many people here do X, Y, and Z. How about if you just proclaim, I did this recently and I discovered the following, and this is why this is going to be useful to you. You're reinforcing your credibility as a subject matter expert.
I think it's, to build on what you're saying, I think it's a missed opportunity. Like if you start with that and then let's say the response is a flop, right? Not many people raise their hands or something. Then you've just missed an opportunity to start off very strong.
And it's something that a lot of people do.
Yeah, I
so
see it
it's
a
just
lot.
sort of like...
And a lot of times it doesn't work.
Right.
And what do you do then, right?
Which is not to say that certain types of interactivity with the audience during a presentation can't be useful. Just don't start that way. It can be particularly effective in an online presentation because once again, if you've been talking for 10 minutes and if you don't know whether those 20 people on the other side of the call are not paying attention or they're secretly texting or doing something like this, if you give them a job, if you do something like a poll during the presentation or just do something that requires a response from the audience, that's a way to ensure that they're still paying attention. But that's unique to the online presentation context.
Okay. And to build, like if you're a new entrepreneur or even if you're a business leader, any tips on basically building relationships with media? Is this something that you need a PR agency for, or is this something that you can
really good question?
Over time?
It depends on what your budget is, I suppose. Ideally, you would find a good PR agency, or ideally you'd have somebody on staff who is knowledgeable about those things and can perform that role. If you're a CEO or if you're a startup founder, you've got a million different plates in the air juggling all the time. And media skills are a specific skill set. And so to answer the question, yes, if you can get some good advice about how to develop relationships with members of the news media, that can help you in the short term and the long term. Even though the way that information is delivered is so different now, personal relationships are still so very important. So if you have 5 reporters who cover your industry, it's a good idea to, maybe with the assistance of a public relations professional, reach out to them. The last thing that a reporter wants is just for some press release to land on their desk out of the blue.
Yes.
If you've made the effort to develop relationships, have a coffee with a reporter at some point and keep them on top of things that will be of interest to them, even if on one day they're not going to do a story about you, which is ultimately what you want. Maybe a month from now they will, because they've come to trust you and know that you're a credible source of information.
Well, that was great, Bill. Any lasting, any final words that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Any final piece of advice?
Yeah, I would just tell people when they're giving a presentation or they're giving a news media interview, as you said, be authentic, be interesting, and make it meaningful to the audience, and try to come up with examples and, as I said before, devices, whether that's a story or a prop or a visual or a quote or something that differentiates you from all of those other boring presenters out there. All of us have seen 1,000 too many dull presentations or kind of worthless interviews that didn't do anything for us. Make the effort to put together content that advances your agenda, but that is helpful to the audience also.
And prepare.
And prepare. And then the last thing I will say is I tell my clients to be themselves plus 20%.
Okay.
What does that mean? It means that particularly something like what you and I are doing right now, an interview, or if I'm standing on a stage and talking to 200 people, you want to be you want to be conversational. You want to talk with the audience rather than at the audience, but you need to be a slightly bigger and slightly more performing version of your regular self. So if my normal conversational tone with you is sort of like, "Hi, Loulou, how are you today? It's great to see you. Beautiful day here today in Dubai." When I'm on a stage, I'm a little bit bigger and kind of brighter, and I project my voice a little bit more. I smile. That's another very important thing. A lot of people in business and in politics and other kinds of leaders feel as though they have to be very serious all the time about delivering the information. To me, it's just the opposite. If you look as though you are enjoying what you're talking about, it does not, within reason, if it's a crisis situation or a really, really tragic situation, obviously not. But most of the time, if you permit yourself to look as though you are engaged by what you're discussing, if you feel passionately, if you're happy to be there, it actually enhances your credibility rather than the opposite. People say, she knows her stuff. I can tell because she's so, I see it in her face.
Yeah.
So.
And not say, "I am so excited to be here today with you."
You hear that so often in business. "Oh, we have a very exciting new project that we're talking." Say it as though you mean it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Bill. It was great having you.
It's my pleasure, Loulou. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Conversations with Loulou with Bill Connor. If you want to know more about Bill's work, you can visit www.3three.fyi. Don't forget to visit the show's website, Conversations with Loulou, to check out all the other episodes. You can also reach out to me there for feedback, for guest recommendations, or for sponsorships. You can also reach out to me on all social media channels at Loulou Khazen. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you watch or you listen to your podcast so that you get the latest episodes. And also don't forget to share to your family, friends, colleagues, and whoever you think will find the content to be useful. See you in a few weeks.